All right, everybody. Thanks again for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today's topic is modernizing marketing strategies for agent distribution. I'm John Yarbrough, Director of Business Development at Appulate here. Joining me is Sameer. I'll let him introduce himself, and then we're going to get this thing kicked off.
All right. Thank you, Johnny, for inviting me to speak at today's webinar. I'd also like to thank everyone who's in attendance for joining us. My name is Sameer Saiya, and I'm the head of professional services at Zoomifier. And I work with insurance markets on the best way to utilize their sales content for agency distribution and to improve sales performance.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining today, Sameer. And yeah, today we're going to cover some great information. So I've been very excited about this. Sameer has brought some really good information to this webinar, and I'm excited for him to go through this. I've got a couple little pieces I'm going to share today, but some quick logistics. Everybody's going to be on mute today, but there's a little question side panel. So feel free at any time if you have a question. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end. We're both checking that question section so that as they pop up, we can answer them as they come in if we're able to. And then at the end, we'll also have plenty of time for more of a Q&A session back and forth. So with that being said, today we're covering a few major topics here in all of this information about marketing and specifically towards agent distribution. Sameer is such a great marketing asset and an expert on this type of topic. And we're covering a few different major key points, which is leveling up your sales content, agent statistics and distribution trends, and the hidden forces acting on your sales content. Before we jump right into that, a little background on both of us. So I'll start here. Appulate, we've been in this space for about 20 years. We're an insurtech company. We are really focused on digital distribution. I've got some information here. You can read through that if you'd like. I'm also recording today's webinar. So anything that you're seeing, we'll be happy to share with you, and we'll also be sending a recording after this. But this webinar is not really about Appulate or trying to share a demo or anything like that. So if you do want to see more about Appulate, what we offer and how we function, giving agents an ability to submit to you and automate their quoting and submission process, happy to talk about that. But I do want to pass this right over to Sameer to give a little background on the company he's with, as that pertains a little bit closer to today's topic. So Sameer, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Zoomifier is a sales content lifecycle management solution. So specifically, Zoomifier enables enterprises, especially insurance carriers and MGAs, to create, manage, customize, engage, and track all their sales content in a single platform. And it's by far the most comprehensive sales content lifecycle management platform that exists. And we really do pride ourselves on helping our customers dramatically improve their sales performance through better utilization of their sales content. And like Johnny said with Appulate, I'm not going to be doing too much of a demo of Zoomifier today, but rather I would like to share a lot of learnings that we've had along the journey with you about sales content.
Awesome. Thanks, Sameer. That's wonderful. Yeah, please reach out. They do such a great job, and I'm so impressed with their technology. But yeah, you're here to learn some stuff. We've got some really cool information. And Sameer, you're going to kick this off here for leveling up your sales content. I'm excited about this. A lot of good stuff on these slides, that's for sure.
All right, awesome. So once again, for those who've just joined, my name is Sameer Saiya, and I'm really excited to get the chance to talk about the role that sales content is playing in helping carriers and MGAs modernize their strategies for agency distribution. But I also want to talk a little bit about the role that sales content is playing in enabling carriers and MGAs to foster stronger relationships and connections with their agency partners and their customers. And so I thought before diving into the sales content part, I'd spend just a minute or two to address that point about relationships and why sales content is playing a larger role in business relationships specifically. So we can go to the next slide. Cool. So, oops. There we go. So it turns out that our brains are only capable of maintaining a certain number of social relationships. And this fact was discovered by a very famous anthropologist named Robin Dunbar in the 1990s. And what he found was the average human brain is capable of maintaining about 148 or 150 social relationships. And not all of these are equal, but you can think about, you have 5 or 6 people in your closest circle, your loved ones, 10 to 15 good friends, 20 to 25 friends. And this can include both personal and business relationships. And essentially, as one moves away from the closest circle, the number of relationship grows larger, but the strength of the relationship goes down until a certain point, which is somewhere around 150, that limit at which your brain no longer actively maintains that relationship. Now, this itself is a pretty interesting fact, but what fascinates me about this theory is that for all of human history up until about 20 years ago, these relationships were based on people having some sort of physical interaction with another person. But in the last 15 to 20 years, a new phenomenon has presented itself that affects how we build and maintain our personal and business relationships and connections. And it's this idea of a virtual relationship. And by today, almost all of us have gone through the experience of having to conduct business virtually, or in an increasing number of cases, having to do business in a way called asynchronously, where our partners and our customers prefer to have us send information in lieu of or in order to meet. And this is really where sales content is beginning to play an increasingly important role in enabling businesses, especially in the insurance industry, to more effectively communicate the message of their offerings and continue to build those relationships and connections despite the environment that someone is engaging in. And this is really at the core of everything that I want to share with you today. So Johnny, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, that's great.
So, my goal really is that by the end of this webinar, I've equipped you with some knowledge to create better sales content for this new world that we find ourselves in, and inform you of a few hidden forces that you need to be aware of as you consider how and when you use your sales content. And just given our time today, I will be running through quite a bit of information quite quickly. But after this webinar, if you have any questions, curiosities, or you want to pick my brain about something that I mentioned, I'm more than happy to schedule some one-on-one time to dive into it. All right, Johnny, let's go to the next one. All right, so with that, let's get started. I want to start by sharing maybe 3 questions that I always ask myself when I'm creating or evaluating the effectiveness of sales content. And just to clarify, when I say sales content, I mean sales collateral like brochures, flyers, white papers, plan information, data sheets, videos of any kind like explainer videos, teasers, and any kind of sales presentation material that's being used. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the first question that I ask myself when I look at a piece of sales content or when I'm creating a piece of sales content is the sales content multimodal? So what does that mean? Well, in the 1990s, there was a very famous study done, which was comparing people's preferred learning styles. So whether they were a visual learner, an auditory learner, physical kinesthetic learner by learning by touching, someone who learns by reading or writing, or someone who learns best by problem solving, to their ability to actually retain more information. And in this study published in the 1980s, I believe, they said that if you match someone's preferred learning style to the way that you share information with them, they're more likely to retain information. Interestingly, in 2010, this whole study was debunked as a myth. So the thing was not that if you match someone's learning style to their preferred learning style to the content to learn best, but what they found actually in debunking this educational myth was that the more forms of learning styles you appeal to when you're sharing information, the more likely someone is to retain information. And so, Johnny, I'll have you click once. So when we think about our sales content, we really want to think about how many modes of learning styles we are appealing to when we're delivering information. And a good example of this is a lot of print-based material appeals to one, definitely like one form of learning, which is someone can read the information. In some very few cases, it's also visual, so it might appeal to 2. And Johnny, let's go to the next one. And then we can start to see that how more evolved forms of sales content are starting to take that to the next level. So video is definitely both a visual way and an auditory way to share information. So in that sense, it's a lot more powerful at allowing someone to retain information. Let's go to the next one, Johnny. So this gets interesting, where just by adding subtitles to a video, you make it a lot more multimodal, where the person consuming the content can now obviously see and hear the video, but they can also read the subtitles. So you've now added one more layer of multimodalness in your content. And this final one, and we'll go to the next one, is possibly the form of media that's pushing the envelope on engaging content constantly, which is interestingly video games, right? Video games tend to appeal to the most forms of multimodal interaction when it comes to any kind of media. And so, in my mind, when I ask myself, is your sales content multimodal? It's always trying to strive for hitting as many of these forms of communicating information as possible. Great. So remember to ask yourself, is your sales content multimodal? All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the second question that I ask myself when I'm looking at sales content and evaluating how do I make this more effective is the sales content snackable? And so what do I mean by that? Well, it turns out that people's attention span is very delicate when you ask them to consume content. And generally, the longer the content is, the more likely they are to tune out while consuming it. There was a interesting paper published last year by YouTube. Every year they publish what is their daily average time a user spends on the YouTube app. And for YouTube, it was around 43 or 44 minutes last year, which is quite significant that one application is people spend almost 45 minutes a day on it. Now, in response to that, TikTok published the same information saying how long users spend on that, and users spend an average of 95 minutes on TikTok every day, which is almost double YouTube, right? And so it kind of begs the question, why is it that people are spending so much more time on TikTok than on YouTube, both platforms with kind of the same level of creators? And Johnny, you can click on the next part. So it turns out that it's because the content on TikTok is a lot more bite-sized, or what I like to call snackable. And we tend to consume more content when it's bite-sized. And there's sort of an interesting lesson in this, which is, instead of saying, okay, I have a 10-minute video and I now need to shrink this into a 1-minute video in order to make it bite-sized, you can also think about this by saying, I have a 10-minute video and I'm going to split it into 10 1-minute videos to make it more bite-sized and snackable. And we actually at Zoomifier have seen that that is a way more effective way of delivering any kind of sales content. Now, Johnny, if you can click one more time. In that exercise, we found actually a third dimension to this whole thing, which I think is fascinating, where on the one hand, we can say we can take something and break it up into smaller chunks, and people are more likely to consume it because they don't have that mental block of saying, I need to find 10 minutes of my time to consume this. But what we found is that if you introduce an element of choice in content consumption, people will consume even more because they are choosing their destiny when it comes to what content they're picking. And so this third line over here, making content both snackable but giving people a choice as to what snack they would like to consume is possibly the best way you can get people to consume all of your content without tuning out. So remember to ask yourself, is your sales content snackable next time you're putting sales content together?
That's great.
Right, Johnny.
I love this, by the way. I mean, this is probably one of my favorite things because I'm constantly trying to create a shortened video, and I end up with a 5-10 minute video, and you nailed it. This is one of the things that you say that I really take to heart. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think it's a great sort of lesson in, I do see a lot of people fall into that trap of saying that, like, I want to make shorter, more, impactful content, but that is a very difficult thing to do. And I think taking the first step of just breaking it up is a great one to take.
That's
yeah. Cool. So this last one is actually a big one. Is your sales content self-explanatory? And the reason this is a big one is this is one I see being particularly an issue with most insurance carriers that I work with. And the scenario is simple, is that if someone is handed a piece of content and they spend their time going through it, will they get it or will they not be able to understand it? And I see this, in a lot of cases, especially with, I think presentations are a great example. If I were to take this presentation deck and send it to everyone who's attending this webinar, and then ask you to, go through the material and see how much of that you'll remember and retain, it's not going to be a whole lot. And the reason is because a lot of times presentations in their form factor are best when they are explained, but when we want to leave something behind, you may want to consider a different form factor to leave it behind in that's more self-explanatory. This also becomes, a larger issue because oftentimes leave behinds are shared with others, right? So it's like if you started with something that wasn't super self-explanatory and then someone has to then explain it to someone else, there's a degradation in the amount of information that's conveyed over a period of time. And you can kind of click once Johnny over here. This kind of just is I love Dilbert. Dilbert's actually from the city that I'm in right now. And there's a big difference when you see a comic with the text and without the text.
Yeah, that's a good point. I noticed that here. I mean, obviously, if you just look at the top, but it's just not that funny at all, right? You've got to have some text there for sure. That's wonderful.
Great, and we can go to the next slide. This is just a summary slide. So once again, next time you're sitting down, you're thinking about creating sales content, you're evaluating sales content, you're having that strategy session about sales content, do ask yourself, is this content multimodal? Is it appealing to multiple forms of learning? Is it snackable, or can we make it more snackable? And is it self-explanatory, or should we consider a different form factor for our content to make sure people understand all of it? All right, cool. So those are some, 3 basic questions that I would encourage everyone watching this to ask themselves.
That's great. That's awesome. Like you said, please connect with Sameer. I mean, there's probably, we could spend probably an hour, I would imagine, on this first third of this slide deck. I mean, there's just cover here, but these are some great high level points. The next thing, I mean, also another thing I could probably spend another hour on is some of the research and statistics that we've done here recently. And I've been conducting these surveys of agents over the last 5 years. So the information I'm going to share with you here real quick, and then we're going to go back to Sameer to go into some more marketing information, is just some of the data and statistics we've pulled primarily over this past year, covering about, all 50 states, about 30,000 agents. Again, this is going to cover about 4 years of annual surveys. We did 3 surveys this year alone, one of PNC Markets, which covers down below in that second half on the left, and 2 different surveys this year covering agents in kind of 2 different ways. And one of the things that I really focus on in these surveys, which you can see on our YouTube channel, and I've got some white papers on them and other things. So we cover really a large breadth of information, from what kind of markets that agents prefer to work with, which lines of business are they writing, which classes and trades are they focused on, and just on and on and on. So much data and information. I pulled some of the slides today for this presentation to that I think had the most to do with marketing and provide a little bit of context, which I thought would be a little very, very helpful here as we're just kind of going through some of these strategies. So here's the demographics of who was surveyed. Again, roughly about 30,000 agents. This is the largest survey of independent agents that's done in the industry, which we're all very proud of. It's very cool, but the data we get from this is incredible. And the folks that respond to this, not only do we get a good sense of agency size and a really good spectrum here, as you can see on the top right, but also when we survey markets, for example, we get a really good response from what we call like decision makers. About 71% of them were, and 50% carrier, 50% MGAs and wholesalers. So a really good sample size for both types of surveys that we conduct. One of the first things I wanted to share with you here was just in regard to distribution. How do markets and agents actually find each other? This is kind of one of the biggest questions. So all of the things that Sameer's talking about today, how to build content, how to put it out, one of the biggest questions is, all right, where do you actually put it? Do you put it on something like Instagram, or do you put it out in, you work on search engine optimization? Is networking and conferences important, et cetera? And it just kind of goes on. So if we look at this slide here, I'm comparing two different surveys against each other. One that we conducted of the markets on the right, one of the agents on the left. And what we see consistent with both of these is that both networking and in-person conferences and trade show events and referrals or direct relationships were the most important. Those were the most substantial here. If I remove those two just really quickly and just focus on digital distribution only, then what we find is there's a big difference between agents and markets on actually how they're finding each other digitally. So the big orange slice here, which is other marketing outreach, this comprises all like emails, postcards, phone calls, things like that. That is a pretty large segment. Markets reporting that that's their largest at nearly 46%. But on the agent side, how agents say that they're finding their markets is predominantly through Appulate and similar quote rating systems at a little over 36%, whereas markets are only reporting about 8.5% of markets are saying that that's where they're typically finding their agents. So there's a discrepancy there that's quite noticeable. And this is something that anecdotally I've been talking about for a little while, but now we've actually got some data around it, which is that markets really haven't embraced quoting rating systems as much, and agents have quite a bit. Not only is it making their lives easier as they're going through the quoting process and they're not having to do duplicate entry into multiple portals, but it does allow for this environment where they can find and interact with markets in an insured specific way with all of the nuances that may exist with any particular insured. So if I've got a roofer that's in Kentucky and I'm trying to find workers' comp, it's a lot easier to go to a quote rating system than it even is to email that particular market or to go to Google and do a search on this, because it's not going to consider all of the nuances on that data that's collected. But of course, that scores on agent side much higher than social media and search engines, but you can't ignore it. Those are still very huge segments of this. So with all of that being said, agents say that they're looking for markets. This is kind of a new question that we asked this year. If I'd asked this in years prior, I would assume we'd see some kind of trend here, but 58% of market agents say that they're always interested in new markets and nothing is preventing them from looking for new markets. But the two things that really stood out on here at 10.3% and 12.9% is that it takes too long to submit to more markets and it's hard to find new markets. If you can solve those two problems, you're adding well over 20% of an audience to whoever you're trying to hit, right? So that's one of the biggest I'd say like value props to some of the tech platforms like Appulate and other quote rating systems is that you just open up the door to these agents that are struggling even trying to find you, but then with good marketing content, of course, they're going to understand a lot more about you, which is critical throughout this entire process. So again, I just wanted to high level touch on some of these. If you want some more information on this, please just reach out to me. Happy to share this with you. I mentioned that there's kind of a couple factors here. That being in the right place at the right time is critical. But then also you have to keep in mind what it is that agents are actually looking for. And it's dynamic. There's a huge spectrum of things that agents are looking for, but here's some good statistics on how they stack up one against another. Because I can't tell you how many conversations I have with the market that say, hey, look, agents, if you can give them good commission, that's what they're really after. But it turns out that things like quoting speed, especially during the underwriting process, automating that, agents care about that more than commission, about 8-to-1. So there are some of these factors that are quite critical to pay attention to. And if we look on the left-hand side, the question asked was, what is going to discourage you from submitting business to your currently appointed market? So these would be the agents you're working with today. Why would they actually leave you or not submit to you anymore? Versus on the right-hand side, when they are shopping and looking for markets, maybe they're not going to leave you, but when they are looking for somebody else to quote with, here's what they're looking for. So on the left-hand side, the major reasons that an agent say that they're going to stop submitting to the current market that they're working with would be things like appetite at 60%. No surprise there. Obviously, they're not going to submit to you if you can't write the business that they're trying to write. But then we get into things that are pretty important. Almost 50% say that quote turnaround is too slow. So if that's a factor, then we don't want to submit to this market if they're being too slow. We've got a lot of data and information on both what current agent quoting speeds are versus what they actually expect from a market. Might not be what you think, actually. So it's pretty interesting. They don't all want it instantaneously, but roughly about 80% of agents are wanting a quote within 24 hours. So there are some things to really pay attention to there. Then we get into other things like premiums being too high, too many supplementals or proprietary forms. They do have a better alternative that are providing a faster quote or a better pricing. But then we start to get into things like commissions are too low and lack of personal service or product support, all hovering around that 20 to 25%. So a lot of interesting information here. And then, of course, when it comes to prioritizing new market relationships, they do want those instant quotes. They do want faster underwriting and forms processing. It does seem to be that speed is really the key to most of this. So if they can get good information about your products, if they can find out who you are and what you do in a quicker, more efficient way, but then actually when it comes time to quote with you and interact with you, they're still seeing all of that relevant information, not just a brochure, but hey, how do you actually handle this particular insured? How quickly can I get a quote back? That seems to be absolutely key right now. So to hit a couple more slides that I wanted to add on here, when we asked markets how they typically receive submissions from agents, there was a big difference also between MGAs, wholesalers, and carriers. This wasn't necessarily surprising to a degree, but some of these were. So with about almost 90%, I think it's about 87% of MGA still receiving submissions via email, compared to just a little over 50% with carriers. They could select all their options, by the way, on here, and this just kind of reflects how many of those carriers selected these options. It looks like carriers are using their online portals a lot more than MGAs and wholesalers. However, MGAs and wholesalers have taken advantage of these distribution platforms and other outside integrations, like with agency management systems, a lot more than carriers have. And funny enough, about 65% of agents prefer a distribution platform. So I think MGAs and wholesalers have really taken advantage of something that I hate to call it a trend, because sometimes trends end, but the trend statistically over the last 5 years has been consistent, that agents are increasing in their preference towards using these systems and platform integrations, and do not prefer to use an online portal. And we've also seen a trend away from carriers towards MGAs and wholesalers by a little over 20% over the last 3 years. So that's been very significant as well. A couple more slides here. So one question that we asked was, what type of information or resources would be most effective in helping you win business? I wanted to add this in here, especially with the subject at hand, but the types of points that Sameer is making. He's talked a little bit about, hey, how do you make this effective? How do you make this bite size? This might be a good way to think about this. I mean, there's probably a number of ways to make your information snackable. But to me, when I look at the statistics, I'll look at something like this and go, great. Instead of talking all about our product and every single thing, what if we did a video or some kind of brochure on each one of these pieces? I would imagine that would be pretty effective. And the first thing right away is product comparisons with coverages and prices. That can be its own topic. For example, talking about new markets or new products that you offer, just high level. These are the things that agents say they need in their hands to win business, to learn more, and to better either educate themselves or their insureds. So again, happy to send this to you. We'll have a recording of this, but there's a tremendous amount of data around these types of things. And the last thing I'll share here real quick before passing it right back over to Sameer would be, how do agents prefer to learn? So this is interesting. I mean, we asked the agent, how do you prefer to get your information? And by far, about 62%, and this has been consistent year after year, with only a slight change, about 1 to 2% per year, has been self-paced learning. So they do like modules, they like videos, things that they can interact with, and that could be an e-learning platform that you've put together. We use one of those ourselves, and we see good agent utilization, good way to pepper in how to find markets, how to interact with them. And I'd imagine that this would be something very effective for you as well. About 78% of agents say that they are open to writing new lines of business if it is an effective process along the submission and quoting process. So if it's quick, if it's fast, if it's easy, but they have some way of learning about that product, they're more open-minded to it. And so you've got to give them this information. I think about something like cyber liability, where maybe their insureds are asking about this quite a bit, but they don't know enough about cyber liability to properly sell it or to explain why that coverage might be important. This is a good way to kind of pay attention to this. 27% prefer webinars. We've seen some great success with that, but only 11% are looking for that one-on-one training. So although agents clearly said that, hey, they want to see some personal service, that doesn't exactly mean necessarily on the training side. It could mean other things. So this is a good way to think about your resources. So again, speeding through this at a pretty high level, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the data that we've captured so far. I'm going to pass this right over to Sameer again. We've got one more section here that I think is fantastic. So Sameer, please take it away.
Perfect. Johnny, as always, I mean, just absolutely tremendous data that you share and insights. There's so many golden nuggets in there. And for me, one of the data points that Johnny had shared with me a few weeks ago and just shared now is that how agents prefer to learn slide. I think that is such an interesting insight. And it kind of goes back to that earlier point I was making, in that when we find ourselves in these new environments of how we have to engage and make connections and build relationships with people, how you teach makes a really big difference, right? And while it plays a role in sales content, it absolutely plays a role in every aspect of the insurance business. Moving forward, in the interest of time, in the first section I presented and I shared 3 questions that you can ask yourself to make your sales content better. And then and getting better information in a quicker fashion is something that Johnny just kind of backed up with awesome data, right? That matters. In this next section, I want to go beyond the creation of sales content and share some lessons that I've learned that impact the effectiveness of how well your sales content performs during its life cycle. So, right, this is beyond the creation of it, but how to make sure it performs as best as possible in its life cycle. And specifically, I want to dive into and talk about 3 really important hidden forces that I want everyone that watches this webinar to be aware of that regularly impact the effectiveness of your sales content. And just a quick disclaimer, the names of these forces are completely made up by me. So if you Google them, you're probably going to find some other information. So let's go to the next slide. All right, and we can go past this one as well. All right, so the first is what I call the rumor trap. And so, I named this trap because I was inspired by this study that was done by 2 psychologists in the mid-50s. And they were interested in knowing what happens to a rumor as they spread, right? Because we all know that rumors spread. That's not the interesting thing here. But the interesting part is, like, what parts of the rumor stay intact, or sorry, not what part of the information stays intact in the rumor, and then what parts change, and then what parts are left behind. And so, the way that this study was conducted was a very detailed image was showed to the person number 1. That person number 1 was studied the picture, and then they were asked to describe that image to person number 2, just like a game of telephone, right? And that person 1 was called the transmitter, and person 2 was called the receiver. And so person 1 tells person 2 about this detailed image, then person 2 becomes a transmitter, and then they tell person 3, right? And so in each of these transmissions, they were saying what happens to the message as it goes through. Now, interestingly, and actually not super interesting, but by 5 or 6 transmissions, about 70% of the data was lost. So that's an important thing to know, but I don't think it's very surprising because it's gone through so many people. The more interesting part about this study was what information remained in the transmissions. And it turns out that that was completely up to the person transmitting the information. And so what does that mean? Well, when we look at the ecosystem of an insurance carrier, right? And Johnny, if you click one more time on this slide, we'll see that information has to go through quite a bit of levels before it gets to our customers or even within the organization itself. And in each of these levels, we are prone to this rumor trap where the transmitter gets to choose what information they would like to pass along to the next person in line. And this is something that I hear all the time from insurance carriers about sharing new plan information or offering details with agency partners, right? It's this constant struggle of we've shared all this information with them, but we're not sure how much of it is actually getting to the insured, right, or the customer. Because at the end of the day, the customer only receives what they hear or they get from an agency. And so sales content plays a role in this, right? And I believe that the purpose here is not necessarily, do I need sales content or not over here, but it's rather what form factor can help you overcome this trap. For example, verbal communication is most susceptible to the rumor trap. But as an alternative, video content is a lot easier to share and can retain the full form of a message in a much better way. And a lot of times what you find is that a video is more likely to be passed along than someone taking the time to explain something as well, right? So the form factor of content matters in order to overcome this. Cool, we can go to the next slide. All right, so this next one is, if anyone knows what this equation is, please put it in the chat. This second hidden force is inspired by one of my favorite thermodynamics and physics concepts, weirdly enough. This equation, and if you click once, Johnny, this equation is about entropy. And the easiest way to define entropy is about the disorder in a system. And it's also important to note that entropy is always increasing. And so, this next hidden force is something I like to coin as content entropy, right? And one way you can think about entropy is if you put a drop of food coloring in water, once you add the food coloring in, it's very difficult to remove it. And so, the same effect is true with sales content, right? The entropy tends to increase and increase quite rapidly as content is created and shared and distributed and copied and rewritten and reformatted and broken apart, right? So tons and tons of things happen to that initial piece of sales content that a marketing communications team spends a lot of time putting together. And this is something that's, I wouldn't say it's always a bad thing, but it's definitely something that's worth paying attention to as you're creating sales content. Because, pairing this content entropy with that rumor trap from before, it is the role and responsibility of a carrier and MGA to ensure that the message remains intact as it goes all the way to the insured. Now, content entropy can happen on any form of content, but one of the things that you want to think about when you're solving for this is how your content is distributed and whether you allow content to be manipulated either by your partners or your own organization. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time at Zoomifier is working with our customers to understand the entropy of their sales messaging, right? And we build technologies to try and keep it as close to zero as physically possible, right? And so this usually, requires getting much tighter control and visibility on how the content is being used. We can go to the third and final hidden force. All right, so this last one is called the junk food effect. Once again, please don't Google any of these and expect any of this information to show up here. These are purely metaphorical names to help understand these ideas. The simple truth is that people tend to reach for the things that require the least amount of energy to access, but amply satisfy their needs. And this is true for food as it is for sales content, right? And our partners and our customers will always try and reach for the stuff that's easier to access. And you can click once, Johnny, I think that'll populate everything on the slide. There we go, cool. And there's two problems though that are presented here for carriers actually specifically. One is that people might reach for another carrier's content solely because it's easier to access, right? And two, and I see this often where carriers are always trying to share new versions of content with their agency partners. But there's no guarantee that they're not just accessing the older version because it was a lot easier to access in the first place, or they had that habit of accessing it. And what's interesting about the junk food effect is this actually requires both a combination of the right form factor of content as well as the right distribution structure. And so, the reason I like to share this, the junk food effect, is because I believe that this is the one that comes up the most in my conversation with carriers specifically, where they say, hey, we have a really big problem in how we distribute our information through our agency channels, and what information they are then sharing with the insured. And so this might be what's going on over there. We can go to the final slide. So that's all from me for this webinar. Thank you everyone for your time and attention. It was a pleasure to share those 3 questions about how to level up your sales content, but then also these sort of 3 hidden forces to consider, to ensure that your sales content is as performant as possible. So, a quick recap on these ones. There's the rumor trap, making sure that the information that you're trying to convey is not getting broken apart or diluted as it goes through many different people. The second one is content entropy, to be aware of the fact that your content is used in various different forms as it gets to the insured. And the last is, of course, this junk food effect, that people will tend to reach for the thing that's easiest to access. If you want to dive into anything I shared today in more detail, or if you want to learn more about Zoomifier or just bounce an idea off of me, please reach out. And maybe, Johnny, we'll go to the final slide. At Zoomifier, we create a bunch of really cool solutions to address the problems that I mentioned earlier. And so always happy to kind of share demos of that or show you how this works, especially in the markets case or for carrier and MGA, so that you get full control of your sales content lifecycle. And I guess last but not least, thank you, Johnny. It's been an absolute pleasure of being on this webinar, and thanks for inviting me on.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everybody who took the time today to hang around. I'm going to stop the recording here in just 1 second, but please feel free to hang around. If you have any questions, feel free to add those to the question pane. Otherwise, please definitely reach out to Sameer or myself. Always happy to have discussions and figure out ways to work together. So that's wonderful. I went ahead and stopped the recording. Again, Sameer, thank you so much. I want to leave maybe another 5 minutes here up. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to just add those to the question pane. Happy to have a bit of a discussion here. But the first thing I wanted to ask you, Sameer, can you talk a little bit more about Zoomifier? I mean, you've given me a deep dive into the system, and I am a big fan. But specifically, one of the things that you guys seem to solve is just helping people put some of these brochures or videos together into these snackable sizes. Do you mind talking about that a little bit? Because I think it's brilliant.
Absolutely. No, I'd be happy to. So there's 5 major things that the Zoomifier platform does in relation to the full life cycle of sales content. The first is the ability to create really breathtaking content. So we have our own content creator called Custom Show. And the cool thing about that is it lets you create not only presentations, but any sales collateral in a single tool. And this is a big deal because most people are juggling, InDesign with PowerPoint, with Adobe Suite to try and create different stuff. We can do it all in one editor. We of course have a very powerful ability to manage all the sales content then with a digital library. But then to your third point that you just brought up, one of the most important things that I think everyone should be considering is how am I personalizing and customizing content before I'm sharing it, right? And so, for presentations, we know what this means. It often means adding logos or different, adjustments on slides. But for sales collateral, we actually have some interesting technology which lets both carriers and agents record themselves on top of content before they share it with whomever they're sharing the content with. And why do you do that? Well, it maps directly back to those sales content questions that you ask, right? Like, which is, it makes it more self-explanatory, right? The ability to explain content in a video form makes it snackable, explanatory, and multimodal, right? It just hitting all of those points. And then of course we have some very sophisticated ways in which we can track what sales content is being engaged by people, what sales content is being used, and also methods to share content in a way that's not only just attaching it to an email, but a lot more sophisticated so that people can access any kind of content anywhere. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, please, if that sounds enticing to you, I know it sounds like, oh wow, that's a lot. It is a lot, but they make it pretty easy. I'm not just trying to sit here and talk you up for no reason. I mean, there's a reason that I wanted to have you on. The platform is so incredibly simple to use, and that was, I think, one of the first things I told you when you were sharing a demo with me, that I've used things like the Adobe products to edit videos and others, and my goodness, it is incredibly simple to use. So pretty much anybody could learn how to do that, and I was blown away by it. So yeah, again, Sameer, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming through right now, so if you do have any questions, please reach out to either of us. But thank you so much for hanging around today, Sameer. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everybody's time, and look forward to hearing from you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Johnny. This is an absolute pleasure. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, guys.